IVM.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Yeah, hi, welcome to today's episode. We're going to be talking about gigs. I think we all know that gigs are here to stay, but we also want to know if we can protect the workers. There's a lot of conversation and angst about the status of workers in this gig economy. I think the first thing that I wanted to say, and I've got a couple of great people on the podcast with me today. One is my colleague and regular partner on this series of episodes on 20 billion jobs, Aarushi Kataria. And I've got our chief guest of the day. I mean, we've got Anupam Manur. He's like a senior advisor to all of us and a mentor on this project. So if you found any of the discussions that we've had in our previous podcasts not palatable or not coherent, etc., just blame it on Anupam, right? So this is what he taught us and that's what we know. So welcome, Anupam. Thanks for making the time to join us today.
Thanks. I found it strange that you were being kind to me at first and then things normalized. So yeah, we're good.
Yeah. I mean, we had to see that's a secret, right? I mean, you first have to make the person feel a little comfortable and then sort of pull the rug from under their feet. I mean, that's how it works. Yeah. So anyway, so I think like I mentioned before, gigs are really here to stay, right? And gigs are not new. The first thing is that lots of people think that gigs are something new, and earlier the whole world was divided into situations where there were employers and there were employees. Every single person on this planet could be identified as either an employer or an employee, and everybody went to work and had like a regular wage, and there was no income volatility and so on. And that's really not the case. Lots of people have been working at gigs, right? Hollywood is a great example of an organization. If you will call it an organization, I would call it maybe an industry that made the shift. In 1948, there was a Supreme Court judgment that forced their hand. Before that, Hollywood used to, there were these 10 studios and they made all the films. They distributed all the films and they even decided where they would be exhibited and for how long and how many days. So even as a viewer of films, you could sort of decide what you wanted to watch. I mean, there were these theaters or these movie halls which showed these films and they could just keep running till people had no other choice but to go and watch them. So maybe like the movies were not great, but these people had a great monopoly over the entire thing. 1948, the Supreme Court in the US took a decision and said that this is not okay and this monopoly should be broken down, right? And therefore, now it became a much more a freelancer kind of environment where lots of people went out and made movies. You didn't have to sort of belong to a studio in order to make a film. So you got people together. They got producer, a director, got together and you got all these other people. You got actors. You had all the other people who make a movie come together for the film. And once the film was made, they sort of disbanded and went their way. The difference is that initially, maybe there were like 20, 30,000 people who had jobs. And these jobs were probably reasonably well paid and they were stable. But today you have maybe a few million people around the world who have jobs, but they don't have that kind of employment, that income stability that the studio workers had. So is this a good thing or a bad thing? Anupam, as an expert on this subject, so what do you think? What's better? I mean, 20,000 people having stable jobs or a million people having jobs with less income stability?
I really don't think it is for any of us to say what is good and bad. It's all relative. I mean, this is not a classic sit on the fence kind of answer, but it's to say what people ultimately prefer and what kind of dynamics have evolved over time. And as you correctly mentioned, there are multiple instances much closer home in our own economies where you'd find aspects of this kind of gig economy at lower rungs, for instance, of income. You'd find, construction workers are classic gig workers in that sense. They work on a particular project with a particular contractor. It gets done. They move on another project for some time. It's temporary. It's not assured. There's no massive amount of protection or social security, etc. So in many ways, we've had this. You can think of cooks, for example, who work again for a particular contractor, maybe in a large scale establishment. Cooks, as in, I don't mean a 5-star chef, but I mean a cook in a marriage hall who will feed you, things like that, right? So you've had this kind of instances in the past. It exists now, and as you say, they're probably here to exist. So in terms of good and bad, I really don't want to go there, but what's interesting, or what we should do as policy professionals, is to look at how can we make this better, right? Which is at every single point, are there options to increase both level of income and increase stability of income, or to put it another way, to lower the variability of income, right? So over time, and people will self-select according to, some people might like a bumper kind of quarter. They work, get high income, probably not work for the rest of the year. That's at, if you're a nice a coder, maybe that can work. But at lower levels of income, I think you will not have extremely high levels of income, so you'll need to work more. But you can work. There are options out there which probably tries to reduce the variability. And I think that's what we should be focusing on. Good and bad is outside our realm. It's happening. So it's about how do you cope with it.
Brilliant. So thank you very much, Anupam. And then on this, Aarushi, do you want to sort of give a sense of how big is this gig economy? I'm reading numbers which are varying quite widely. What are your thoughts on the size of the gig economy in India? And is it growing very fast? Is it growing faster than other types of jobs? What's your sense of that?
So I think, as you mentioned correctly, we don't have any reliable data on, how many people are actually a part of the gig economy. But if we were to take all non-contractual labor as a part of the gig economy, then one study tells us that there are about 145 million people who were a part of this gig economy as of 2017. If you look at a more recent report by BCG, it tells us that this number is probably larger, and that this number is about to grow to double its value in about 8 to 10 years. But I think the bigger issue is how exactly are we going to sit here and define gig workers? What exactly falls under the purview of what a gig worker is? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, go for it.
Sorry, yeah. The fundamental question that has probably not been answered anywhere around the world is exactly that. How do you define gig work? And I find that, so I'm not let's not go into, debates around the world of what is and what isn't a gig job. We might probably get to that later on when we talk about California, for instance. But for now, what I find strange? Right up front, I would like to say that most of the things that we probably classify as gig work in India is actually not gig work, because people are hired, air quotes, with the same kind of company, and they're doing, they're not really doing multiple jobs at the same time. So think about a standard, the life and work of a Swiggy delivery agent, for instance, or if you don't like Swiggy, Zomato, it doesn't matter, right? But that person is more or less doing delivery work for one or two companies at best for throughout their time. That is their primary source of income. It's not an additional one. It's not something that they decided, I'll just go run out and do a couple of gigs and come back in between studies or anything. So these are full-time jobs and the only source of income for a large number of people. That's the same thing with Uber drivers. That's the same thing with delivery executives and every kind of other gig work that we can think of, right? So that's not traditionally how gig work is thought of, defined, or in some sense even policies are made. So that itself, right at the beginning, will throw our conversations off track.
Yeah, I know what you mean. And I think California, you mentioned California, and California came up with this ABC test to sort of determine whether someone can be considered a gig worker, or should they be considered basically a freelancer, or should they be considered an employee of the company. And they said, A, is the worker free from the company's control? B, does the worker perform work that isn't central to the company's business? And C, whether the worker has an independent business, trade, or occupation in that industry. I mean, they made it so hard for anyone to sort of be defined as a gig worker by that logic, right? I mean, I think you'd find hardly anybody would fit into gig work if that were the case. I think, like you said, trying to define it would maybe make it smaller, because the future of employment, as I see it, is gig work. Most people will want to be independent. They want to have more flexibility. As incomes rise around the world, people will want more flexibility and more freedom. And when that happens, I mean, like, having and wanting to, and loyalty to one organization, one type of work, etc., might become harder. So, and organizations also want to take technology changes quite rapidly. So people want to be able to take advantages today, and then, like, and do the best and grow as fast as they can today. So I think gigs are going to be really the future, in both from an employer's perspective as well as from people who want jobs and want seek work. I think even they, as income levels go up, would prefer gig work to sort of traditional forms of employment. So
Yeah.
I think the
The
definition is less important today.
Yeah, absolutely. But see, that California test is just, I mean, it's come under a lot of scrutiny, obviously, around the world. And I don't think that would make sense in India at all. I'm just throwing out an idea for, let's say, Arushi's thoughts, which is, what if we look at level of, I mean, or rather the percentage of total income coming from a particular source? Just not even for policy making, but for our discussion. So if, for example, if 95% of your income comes from just, let's say, Zomato, are you really a gig worker? I don't know. I mean, is that something that we could look at and then define some kind of thresholds and yeah, or reference points to say that above a particular level, then it seems more like you're tied down to one company. That is one aspect. And the other aspect is, for how long has this been happening? So 95% of your income just for 1 month, maybe you're still a gig worker because you can move on. But 95% of your income comes from one company for the last 2 years. I would say that's probably a very clear case that you're not a gig worker. You're tied down to one company in more ways than what is readily apparent. So I think these are few things that we can evolve. I've just thrown things off the top of my hat, right? It's not well thought through, but I'm sure we can evolve a set of criteria which is makes more sense closer home.
Yeah, I agree with that. That if like both things matter, whether how much of your income you're earning and for how long has this been going on, that they both should be important criteria. And I think this becomes even more important because the problem that we're facing today is not just about unemployment and not having jobs, but also the fact that when you make these classification strategies, what ends up happening is if you misclassify somebody where you have inclusion and exclusion errors, you're probably not letting somebody get access to certain policy benefits that they could have otherwise. So unless we can come up with a very strong framework about what it really means to be a gig worker, I think what makes more sense is that everybody who's employed in any form for that matter should have access to some kind of safety net, which is something that Sridhar and I were discussing today morning about how there's this need that a safety net needs to be provided if you're working. Now, this doesn't always have to come from the employer themselves. It can come from other, policies that are funded by the state. It could come from the employer. For instance, maybe the employer ties up with a fintech company to tell you that, okay, this month maybe your variability in income is going to be higher, but we cover the cost for you this month. And when you have that higher income next month, you pay it back to the fintech company. Or you have the state sponsoring this in some way or the other from their coffers through the taxes that people are paying, through the taxes that companies are paying. You probably have the RBI step up with a financial inclusion, financial literacy project where you have people understanding that if you have 5,000 rupees in hand coming to you every single month, but in 1 month you see a higher wage coming to you, you don't spend all of it. You have to save some of it, you have to spend some of it to maintain a certain amount of, constant value in how much you're spending and how much you're not. So I think those questions become more important, as you mentioned, rather than just a definition of what a gig worker is.
Absolutely. And I think Harvard Business Review agrees completely with you, Aarushi. I was reading an article from 2020 where they actually has a name which is very similar to what we are saying. We're saying like gig workers are here to stay. It's time to give them benefits. That's really what the Harvard Business Review article is titled. And they say that, the biggest problem to American economy right now, as they say, is mass unemployment and not misclassification. And that's totally true for India. And I think that's what we should be worried about. I think in a country like India, where we talk about 18 million people getting to the age of 18 every year, 800 million people being underemployed in agriculture, all this means that we need to create at least 20 million jobs every year. If we need to create 20 million jobs every year, if we get bogged down by classification and trying to put brakes on people generating jobs through the gig economy, we would be hurting ourselves much more than anything else. So I personally am of the opinion that, maybe something's not a gig, but it's being called a gig. Maybe people are trying to avoid paying certain employment benefits and therefore calling people gig workers. But my view is like, hey guys, I mean, till we get to a point where we can generate 20 million jobs, can we really afford all these niceties of classification, etc.? And should we be just focused on generating more jobs? That's the way I think, Anupam. What are your thoughts?
You've absolutely nailed it. I mean, I generally don't like podcasts where we're all agreeing with each other, but I think it's impossible to disagree on this front. All of these topics about, bad working conditions or not enough pay, etc. The root of all of that is just quite simple, right? That is, the supply of labor far outstrips the demand for it. In every single aspect, not just in gig economy, but in every single other aspect, right? So because you don't have any other jobs, people will take whatever they get. And if it means, yeah, being a delivery executive, which uh, earns you a pay instead of zero, then so be it, right? I think Therefore, I think one of the most important aspects in terms of our discourse and conversation is to not get carried away by what California is doing.
Yeah.
The reality of California is very different from that of Bangalore, and the reality of Bangalore is very different from the reality of elsewhere in India, right? So in that sense, it's very important to have that kind of context, and the context is that we're just not creating enough jobs.
Yeah.
There's far too high unemployment and underemployment, and compared to those alternatives, most people would prefer having even a gig job where the payment might be sometimes lesser than, we've heard stories, right, where your wages are sometimes lower than minimum wage, or it means really long working hours, or it might mean, yeah, there's no security. Yeah, all of those things are terrible. But the option is not, as some people mistakenly believe, the option is not that kind of terrible scenario against a plush, whatever white collar job as and the CEO of a company. The option is that versus no job at all. And given those two options, most people would prefer having some form of income rather than none. And therefore, you should not make any kind of policy recommendations or enact any form of policies that might even kill this little form of employment generation that exists in the
Yeah.
economy.
Arushi, you want to question Anupam on his sort of very strong opinion on this subject? Should the government do something don't you think the government and society at large do something to prevent employers from, the laws exist in order to protect the weak, right? So if somebody is desperate for a job and therefore is capable of being exploited, then employers could, if there were no good laws, the employers might just exploit them. So do you think the government should do something about all this?
So I think the first thing that we have to remember is, despite all of the flaws of a gig economy, the one thing that it's been good at is whenever there is someone who's looking for a job, it's able to connect them to somebody who's in need of the service that this person can provide. So I think that's something we always have to remember. But at the same time, there is some logic as to why some laws have existed, in especially in the labor force. Like, this could be, minimum wage, having unemployment insurance, and the fact that people are given loans at lower wages and lower interest rates. And I think the question then becomes is that, if you have gig workers who have such high volatility in their incomes, doesn't it make sense to ensure that some form of the safety net that we spoke about comes from, say, a minimum wage, so they're guaranteed that at least this fixed wage is going to come to them? Or in case there's a bad month where they haven't been able to get the kind of gigs that they wanted, can they be given an unemployment insurance, something that isn't obviously credited to them because they aren't, part of, an employee, so to speak. So I think those would be my questions. What could be, one, the intended consequences of these policies, as well as unintended consequences of such policies?
Yeah, those are two options for sure that has always existed in terms of labor. But both of them come with, well, a lot of baggage, right? When you have a minimum wage law, we know what happens. Again, there is enough kind of debate on this, and I don't want to make a proclamation, but more often than not, when there is such massive supply of labor and not enough demand, you introduce a minimum wage on top of that, uh, employees will just switch. Employees will switch to those people who will say, listen, I don't want a minimum wage, just give me whatever and I'll take it. Is that good or bad? Again, it's outside the realm. This is what will happen, right? Minimum wage is good when most people have an option to say no. Here, right? I mean, when I say option to say no, a worker will say, unless you give me the minimum wage, I will not work. That is not the situation today. People are desperate enough to say, you give me whatever, I will work. So the person who says, I want minimum wage will basically not get employed. Yeah, Sridhar?
So, Anupam, I think I had a question on this minimum wage thing, and I know you feel strongly on the subject. I've heard you sort of discuss that at great length even last week, despite lots of data to the contrary, right? I mean, that was really very strong because I think somebody took out a report and showed and indicated that there was no jobs were lost despite minimum wages being sort of in place. But that's one aspect of it. But I think the more important thing is, I mean, why do minimum wages exist? They exist because the workers may be may have low bargaining power. They may be desperate for jobs. There might be large number of people competing for a job, and therefore people may be willing to work at any kind of wage. And I mean, let's say they might be willing to work for 100 rupees a day or 50 rupees a day because they can't get a job at all. And this should not be used by employers to exploit people and keep driving wage down. And a certain minimum floor will ensure something. Isn't that why minimum wages exist? I mean, they wouldn't exist if people were in a position to say no, then there would be no need for minimum wages.
There's absolutely no argument against anything that you said, but good reasons for something to exist will not mean that it'll work.
Yeah.
I mean, you're conflating two really separate issues here, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's actually good reasons for why rent control should exist. So there should be good reasons for why, let's say, price caps on medicine should exist. I mean, they're good reasons. But we are not looking after intent, right? I mean, there's good intent behind all of these things as to why they should exist. But ultimately, it's about what will happen when you do it, and that evidence is quite clear. As I said, when you impose rent controls, there will be a whole bunch of things: underground economy, squatters, dilapidated buildings, etc. When you have minimum wage, you will eventually have an underground market for labor, which is not something that you'd want. In fact, I mean, as it is, exploitation is quite high, as you've rightly noted. And then you throw in an underground market on top of that, which is what exists most of the other places, but it's just going to drive things even worse.
Yeah. So thank you very much for that. And with this, we should take a short break and we'll get back soon.
Your computer can be compromised in many ways, and all cyber attacks ultimately affect your files and apps by accessing everything that's on your PC. Intel vPro keeps you safe from cyber attacks using the Intel Hardware Shield, which has 3 groups of capabilities. First, advanced threat protection, quickly detecting issues like ransomware and crypto mining. Second, below the OS security, identifying unauthorized changes to hardware. And lastly, application and data protection, preventing malware injections. So, secure your organization's productivity with Intel vPro's hardware-based security. Visit intel.in/IT heroes to know more. Remember, Intel vPro is built for business.
All right, welcome back. And I think we were talking about the need for minimum wage, or the fact that while the need for minimum wages exists, minimum wages may not give you the results that you're hoping for. And the impact of having a minimum wage and enforcing one might be to drive work underground. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
so back to this conversation around.
Yeah, so let's take up the second point that Aarushi made.
Yeah.
If the first option is minimum wage, and yeah, especially in a country like India with very low state capacity, etc., I don't think that will necessarily work. I mean, we already have minimum wage laws in most other places, but then you have contract workers, right? So let's leave that aside and move on to the second bit, which is what can you do to kind of ensure not ensure, but try and lower the variability of income. And unemployment insurance is one option, as she mentioned. Again, that probably requires a sophisticated setup. But here's the good part: what the gig economy has successfully done is brought thousands and thousands and thousands of people, probably millions of people, into the financial network, which they hitherto didn't exist. Right? They have accounts now, bank accounts, because that's where it's payments are made. They have some form of Aadhaar card identification, probably PAN card, maybe not, but there are at least enough mechanisms out there to ensure other forms of social security. And between the two, I would always prefer the latter form, because at worst you'll have some form of inclusion error, which is okay. I mean, if you end up giving money to someone, let's say by mistake, it's better than having the form of problems associated with minimum wage, which is that essentially you allowing people to not get employed. And before you know it, this is my prediction, okay, and I'm being quite bold, you introduce a minimum wage law, before you know it, you will have drones delivering Swiggy orders to you. That's what,
and that's exactly the problem, right? Absolutely. I think that you bring out a very interesting point, Anupam, which is, I think while we were discussing this 20 million jobs project, we realized that for India to grow and get 20 million jobs, we need two things. One, that the economy has to grow at over 10% per annum. And two, our employment elasticity has to come back up to 0.4. It used to be 0.4 in the 90s, and it's come down to less than 0.1 today, maybe at 0.087, etc. So a very jobless growth is what is happening already. And then if you go out and do things like enforce minimum wage, you would sort of curtail job creation. So I think that's one. I think the other point that you mentioned around how do you provide some kind of safety net? I think there is a need for safety net. The wage volatility is an absolute reality, and they need help. I think Aarushi gave an idea around having financial literacy so that people understand that they need to save for a rainy day. She also brought out a very interesting idea around fintechs. I think it's very true that, let's say, if you're an Ola driver or an Uber driver or like a Swiggy delivery person, there is enough data available with those organizations about your income and what's happening with you, right? They have all that data. So they can then tie up with a fintech very easily and provide loans to people to make sure that in months that their income has dropped quite dramatically, maybe they can make up the loss with that. And then on subsequent months, they can recover the money. But at the same time, since the loans could be guaranteed by the organization themselves, maybe they could get lower rates of interest than they would if they were to apply for loans directly. I think that's a very, very interesting and a very viable idea, in my opinion, to protect against wage volatility with minimal cost. It's minimal cost to all the parties concerned, right? I think the cost of just providing a little bit of a guarantee to the loan is not too much to ask of an organization that can benefit from having low wage volatility, etc., and all that too. Low fixed costs that they would have to incur otherwise if they were to have like all these people as permanent workforce in their organization. So that's something. But more importantly, I want to ask this question around whose responsibility is it to provide this safety net? Is it that of the employer, or should it be of society at large? So I was reading this article, which again, this Harvard Business Review article, which talks about should we consider shifting some of these costs from employers onto society at large? So then you'll stop worrying about classification issues. Then nobody is worried about whose job is it to provide this benefit or that, but then society at large sort of pays for it, and overall, whether it's health insurance, whether it's unemployment benefits, whether it's PF or whatever, all these are something that society sort of pays for. What are your thoughts on that?
Right. So I think the first thought would be that the employer paying for it might just disincentivize them. Like as you said, that if we were to set in some kind of minimum that they were supposed to, guarantee to these workers, it might just lead to them not employing these workers to begin with, saying that most of the jobs that we're looking at today are not, at least for the gig workers that we're talking about at the lower rungs, aren't something that require extremely high skills. They can be easily replaced with technology that we do have today. Like as Anupam mentioned, you have drones that will come and deliver the food to you. So I think one thing that we have to remember is that economics is based on incentives. So if we're saying that we want to incentivize the workers by providing them some form of safety net, we also have to ensure that we're not taking away the incentive that is currently there with the employers to even employ these gig workers to begin with. Maybe the reason why employers are employing these gig workers is because they aren't fettered by the laws that are there if they were to be full-time employees. The second point about whether should society fund these safety nets for the gig workers, one could argue that we already do that in some form of the other when we pay our taxes. And there is already a very small percentage of the population that is eligible to pay taxes that pays these taxes. So wouldn't it just become a double burden on those who are already paying the taxes are going to now again cover the safety net for somebody else? So I think again, then it becomes, if you're disincentivizing the consumer itself, the demand for the gig workers goes down, and then so does their employment. So I think that is something that we have to consider, is that the incentives have to match at all points for the employer, for the gig worker, as well as for the consumer.
Yeah, that's interesting. So one of the questions right up front about who's got to pay, unfortunately, I mean, again, this is an answer that people will not like, but it comes down to elasticity of demand, right? So when the classic case being this, right? Think about when we talk about, for instance, tax incidents, right? Who bears the burden of tax? The answer lies in the elasticity of demand. So for inelastic products, tax burden can be very quickly shifted to the end consumer, right? And where there is elastic demand, the producer will bear the brunt of it. So in this case, where where demand is quite elastic, it means that because I mean, essentially there's a lot of supply of labor. You can't actually get employers to pay for a lot of this because, as we've mentioned, right? So that's one of the kind of problems with getting the employers to pay. I'm just stating this stating the same thing that Aarushi said, in probably slightly using economic jargon, but that's what it comes down to, right? Now, in terms of society paying, and I think this is absolutely necessary when you talk about variance of pay, right? It's not what are the big setbacks for which you will need some form of or setbacks or big kind of money that you would require, right?
Right.
Two things that the government can, or state in at large, can readily take care of is education and health. The minute you have some form of universal health care, right, and some form of free public education, those are two massive burdens of expenditure that you can take away from the individual, right, from the gig worker, and therefore that kind of variance stabilizes. As in, you might still have the variance, but that's a variance you can live with, because there are two important things, especially health. Education probably still, I mean, education is about the next generation, right? And we can talk about that later. How do you get the next generation to kind of escape the same kind of trap? But healthcare is something that is immediate, right? Because when you have high variance and no social safety net, then that is when the trouble happens, because one kind of hospital visit can demolish a person's savings. You don't want that. So if you can take care of that bits at least, then the variance is okay. I mean, that again, it's not great, but that's at least reduced burden. So that's something that you can very seriously look at. Some form of unemployment insurance, maybe. Again, this can be private, this can be public. Private, by the way, there are, exactly as you mentioned, there are individual kind of now startups who are looking at how do you leverage this. Now, here's the good news, relatively good news. for some of these things to work, you need scale. And that is something that India has. Just the number of people working, if each one makes even a very small contribution, and the rest comes from even government, by the way, which is society paying in through the taxpayers' money, you kind of add these two things together to kind of form some form of new financial product, which can reduce again the variance. I think
Yeah.
these are what we should be looking at: new age, technology-based solutions. And as I've said, two things work in our favor. One, the fact that a lot of people are inside the financial system now, and two,
Yeah.
scale works. So both of that put together, I think you can form solutions.
Yeah.
If I may, and if you, I mean, if that is, unless you cut me off, I'm going to keep going on. The
Yeah.
third
We're
thing,
trying
which I
to,
really
but go on. Yeah. No,
yeah,
please go on.
the third solution that I'm thinking of, right, is how do you play on consumer consciousness? Okay, and what I mean by that is, now there are a few things that are happening. I mean, I just came across this really interesting paper and some thought on this, which is called the Fair Work Framework. Okay, which basically looks at, is there fair pay, what are the conditions of work, contracts, management, and what kind of representation they have, etc. Now you can have some kind of variance of this, you don't need exactly this, but that basically creates a form of ranking of
Mm-hmm.
your gig employers. I know those two things are probably the thing, but we'll let it slide for now. But but it ranks them on all of these conditions. And now, can you publish these results such that the consumers will start choosing from places that offers better, that ranks better on these terms than otherwise? And then, therefore, the competition between companies to get consumers
Yeah.
might force them to give better conditions for gig workers. And I mean, this might seem far fetched, but it's not, because look at the outrage cycle, look at all of these things that are happening. You can leverage that.
Yeah. I mean, the other day I was talking to somebody who wanted to order something from Amazon and chose not to order from Amazon and bought from a source which was more expensive because they believed that the policies that a certain organization's following is not correct and so on. So I think people do have, I mean, there are people who are not really well off and still are willing to spend a few dollars more, a few rupees more in order to do the right thing. So that's a great idea to sort of rank. But of course, there will always be people gaming those ranks, and the value, the reliability of those ranks become questioned after a point. But nevertheless, I think that's a great approach. I mean, that's at least it's better than not doing anything about it. That's one. The second thing is, see, people can be exploited because they lack education. They lack means of getting, their skill levels are really low, and therefore they can't get skilled work. They only take on unskilled work. So you can be exploited much more when under these circumstances. So I think we talked about using technology, and I think that one use of technology we already mentioned around fintechs connecting with gig employers to give loans to manage income volatility. So that was one. The second area where we can use technology and the financial markets is um, how do you use things like securitization to finance at-risk loans, which are given to gig workers who can go out and upskill themselves. So here is somebody who is unskilled, who's probably like earning 10, 15,000 rupees a month. And you tell this person that I'll give you 45,000 rupees to compensate for, say, 3 months' wages. And I'll give you another 55,000 rupees for the training program. So a total of 1 lakh rupees will be given to you as a loan. And you repay this loan if your income is above 15,000 rupees. If after this training you get a job which pays you, let's say, 20,000 rupees, then maybe you repay 1,000 rupees a month, and maybe you repay it for maybe you repay 2,000 rupees a month and you repay it for 5 years or something to pay off this loan. So I think something like this, and that will be the at-risk loan part. But then you take a pool of all these loans and securitize them, and then you can have a financial market which will then finance this, right? So you can have people who are philanthropists, you can have the government, etc., subscribing to the junior most tranches and the equity tranches so that they have the least seniority when it comes to being repaid. And you can have the regular financial markets funding the larger part. And as more data gets accumulated, you will find that the more useful training and the training that's generating income gets financed better. And probably there'll be less need for equity tranche holders to or they'll make big profits, the equity tranche guys, so that they can reinvest in other things. So that's another idea that you've got.
That's interesting. That's really fascinating. Yeah, I'm sure. And here's the immediate thought that comes to my mind, right? If duds like you and I, not Aarushi, you and I, Sridhar, can think of really, schemes like this, I'm sure there are a lot of other clever solutions. That's what gives me hope, in fact.
Yeah, absolutely. On this note, Aarushi, would you like to do you have some concluding thoughts on this subject? I think we came up, maybe you can conclude you can tell us what you think.
I think what we need to conclude with is the fact that this recession, the one that we're probably in right now, and the one that we've had before this, have all given rise to conditions where firms want to reduce the costs that they're facing. And what that's invariably done is increase the number of contractual or gig workers, as we've been talking about, that they've employed. And when they're in this phase where they've realized that, I can significantly drive my costs down by employing these workers, it is going to be difficult to ask them to shift back to hiring somebody full-time and paying for their social security and all of those things. So I think what we need to do at this point is probably start having conversations about, one, obviously stop the argument about how are we defining a gig worker. As we've seen in multiple occasions, the problem is not about who to include, but rather who gets excluded. The exclusion error has a very high social cost that I don't think we're ready to even start talking about today. And the second thing is that incentives matter. If we really want to provide the safety net that we've been talking about, we need to think about what are the incentives that will work for the workers, that will work for firms, that will work for the consumers themselves. While consumers are becoming a little more aware that, we don't want products that were probably made by child labor, we don't want products that were made, with animal products, I don't think that kind of awareness has come that if something's getting delivered by a gig worker, we won't take it. So even now, our consciousness is simply about how things are being produced, but not about how they're being delivered to us. And until that kind of consciousness rises up in us to be like, unless you pay my gig worker enough to deliver this product to me, I wouldn't buy from you. I think we have a lot of work on our hands to probably create the right incentives to start policy discussions on what can actually be done.
Thank you. This was great. The great discussion. Thank you very much, Anupam. Thank you very much, Aarushi.
Thanks. My pleasure.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On this very special 150th episode of Advertising is Dead, Varun's in conversation with Pooja Dhingra, pastry chef, podcaster, and founder of Love 15 Patisserie. Do check out this episode for a look at her journey as a creator and entrepreneur. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam is joined by Ravi Ravulaparthi, CEO and co-founder of Kapita FinTech. They discuss the problems when it comes to ESOPs, i.e. employee stock options. Facebook announced their rebranding and its ambitions on becoming a metaverse company. On Simplified, Tony, Chuck, and the others talk about what this means. On All Things Policy, Ruturaj Gowaikar and Aditya Parikh discuss the European Union's Arctic strategy. And on Say No to Drama, tune into episode Moodiness, My Birthright, as Chetna talks about how you can be as moody as you want to be. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And do follow us on YouTube. We have a number of different channels. You can find them on ivmpodcast.com/YouTube, where you'll be able to take a look at all of the channels we have. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week: Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quarter, CoinSwitch, Kuber, Slay Coffee, Intel, and Oxfam India. Thank you so much. You make this possible.
Don't you think that if everyone around you is getting smart, you better be smarter? Hey there, I'm the traveling professor Sridhar Deshmukh, and I'm back with season 2 of my podcast to make you smarter. Smarter with Sid. What's this season's focus about? Well, it's about 10-minute nuggets that will make you stand out at work. It's time to go from smart to smarter. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday and become smarter with Sid.